And at one stage, the Grand Medical College was ranked higher than Calcutta and Madras. In this hospital, Bhau Daji and his brother are treating more patients than all the English physicians in Bombay combined together. People have undergone tremendous amount of hardships. Shouldn't we at least know about them and respect them and honor them for it?
So you have done a lot of research in ethics. At the same time, you have done a lot of research in the history also, and especially our beloved Grant Medical College. So I would like to know how the college was founded.
We had a governor in Bombay. At that time, all the governors were British governors. I'm talking of the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And we had a governor called Mount Stuart Elphinstone, after whom the Elphinstone College is named. Not Elphinstone Road, that was his nephew. This was in 1822, 1823, somewhere around that time. In London, there was the board of directors of the East India Company. And it was the East India Company which was ruling India from Calcutta. Calcutta was the headquarters. The board of governors over there had a gentleman by the surname of Grant. He was the father of Robert Grant, after whom the Grand Medical College is named, his father. So his father put a condition in the functioning of the East India Company that the East India Company must spend so much money. And it was, for those days, a considerable amount of money, in educating Indians, which up to that time was not considered a function of the East India Company. They were a trading company. They were there to make profit. They were not here to improve the lot of Indians. But Grant made it a condition that you will spend so much money every year on educating Indians. And so Calcutta set up the first medical school. The very first medical school in India was set up in Calcutta. As soon as Mount Stuart Elphinstone learned that Grant has made this condition and Calcutta has already set up a medical school, he said, we must have a medical school in Bombay also.
During what time, sir? This Calcutta school, when did it start?
I think 1822, 23, something around that, somewhere around that.
Okay.
A little before the Bombay Medical School started, by Elphinstone. So they started the school. Now what did the school consist of? It consisted of one teacher. His name was John McLean. This one teacher had one munshi. Munshi means clerk, and two peons. This was the school, medical school. One physician, one munshi, and two peons. Now, because in Calcutta, education was in the regional language, Bengali, they said here it has to be in Marathi or Gujarati. These were the two main languages in this Bombay Presidency. Remember, at that time, the governor was the governor of Bombay Presidency. Bombay Presidency was parts of Pakistan, the whole of Maharashtra, a large chunk of Karnataka. All this was Bombay Presidency. This guy, the governor of that. Powerful person, politically. So they decided that they will have medical education in Marathi and Gujarati. But there are no books. So how is the student going to learn? So the government told McLean, in addition to teaching students, you will translate books which you will get from England into Marathi. Now imagine, one man had to teach medicine, meaning he had to start with anatomy, physiology, materia. At that time they called it materia medica. What we call pharmacology was materia medica. All this he had to treat. Plus he had to translate English books into Marathi so that the boys could read. And there was no criterion for who is eligible for admission. Whoever wants to come can come. So even raw children who had no concept of education, because it was all free, they came. Now this made life very difficult, and there was no hospital attached. So he was supposed to teach medicine with all these handicaps plus no patients, and he's supposed to teach medicine. So he kept on begging officially to the government, please give me a hospital where I can take these guys and show them patients. And there was something called the Native General Hospital near what is Metro Cinema today. In that area, there was a Native General Hospital. He said, give me access to this Native General, so I can at least take them there. I can understand you don't want them to see white patients, but at least let them see native patients. No. So after about 4 or 5 years of this kind of thing, nothing emerged from the hospital by way of a good working physician who could be of any help to society. The idea of this school was that we will produce Indian doctors who will look after Indian patients. But it was not possible with these circumstances. So after about 4 or 5 years, an analysis was made of the functioning of this institution, and it was decided that this institution was non-functional and should be closed down. So it was closed down. Finished. End of medical school. Then Sir Robert Grant was appointed as governor. And when he was appointed, one of the first decisions he made was there must be a medical school where medicine is taught to Indians. The moment he said this, everybody pounced on him. We've already tried that. It has failed. Indians are incapable of learning medicine. Forget it. Yeah, don't waste your time and energy on this. But he had a very, very able physician of his own, because he was the governor, he was entitled to a personal physician. That physician's name was Charles Morehead. So Charles Morehead was his personal physician. So the two of them worked on this project. The first thing they did was to go through all the records of the medical school, from beginning to end. Then they found all the deficiencies in the medical school, which McLean had already pointed out, but which the authority did not bother to obey or follow or improve. And then they created a project that we need a medical college, not a medical school. Education has to be in English. Minimum matriculation qualification is required before a student can come in. Okay, and so on. And the standard of education should be at least as good as it is in England or in Europe. It has to be. You can't expect second-rate and third-rate clinicians because they're going to treat Indians. They have to be first-rate physicians. So all this plan was formulated, and they had a lot of opposition. But they overcame all that opposition. Finally, there was opposition. The governor never functioned in isolation. There was something, his title was Governor in Council. That means he had a council of people helping him. The council consisted of the general of the Bombay army. Each province, each presidency had its own army. Bengal army, Bombay army, Madras army. There were 3 presidencies at that time. So the general of the Bombay army, and there were 3 or 4 civil officials, and Robert Grant as the head chief. But he could not dictate anything. Everybody had to agree. Only then he could do what he was proposing. Most times they agreed because he was, after all, the boss. But sometimes some of them disagreed. So one of them disagreed. He's saying, look, you are saying all this is going to involve so much expenditure for the government, and we have already tried this, it has failed. Why are you going into all this again? So he has written some minutes, Robert Grant, and those minutes are available to us. And they are heart-rending minutes, heart-rending, coming right from his own heart, you know. He says, if this is what we are going to do, and if this is how we are going to behave, are we human beings? There are people who are dying and they are suffering, there are epidemics, and there is no physician available to look after them. They carried out a survey. What is medical practice in the province presidency of Bombay? And they collected statistics. They sent a questionnaire to civil servants, to enlightened native individuals, to principals of schools, to vaccinators. They used to have something called vaccinators for smallpox. They sent questionnaires to all these guys, detailed questionnaire. Questionnaire is available, answers are available to us. Even today you can go and read them in the Department of Archives in Elphinstone College. They tabulated all these things and they used this evidence and they said, look, this is what is happening in this presidency. You want this to continue? Or you want somebody who, you want to generate a whole cadre of Indians who can go out and treat these people as full-fledged doctors, not as second-rate and third-rate doctors. Finally, his council agreed. Now, council agreed doesn't mean it has now to go to Calcutta. Calcutta has to agree. Calcutta eventually agreed. That is not enough. It has to go to England and England has to agree because this means recurring expenditure. Recurring expense means you need sanction from London. So it went to London. And as all this process was going on, there is a minute written by Sir Robert Grant. They used to write what are called minutes. Minutes were official notes which they wrote. He wrote a minute telling his colleagues that, look, I'm harassing you, I'm pushing you, what is happening, because you know in this country everything is uncertain. And I want this thing to be resolved quickly so that we can start. He wrote this and then he went to the summer capital of Bombay, which at that time was a place called Dapuri, which is near Pune. And there he had a stroke and he died. The papers were between Calcutta and London. And he died. So he never saw his college. He never saw it. Now, before sending those papers off, he said, look, one of the big problems was that McLean had no hospital. We have to plan for a hospital. So he started looking around and he spread the word around that we have to plan a hospital. So Jamsetji Jeejebhoy heard of it and he came and said, I'll give you the hospital. I'll give you the entire hospital, don't worry. You are working for us, I'm willing to give you this. Yeah. So with this proposal, Jamsetji's proposal that I will give you the whole hospital as you have planned it, his case was strengthened. Therefore, he sent it to Calcutta and it went to London. He died and a note came from London sanction. So that's the genesis of the Grand Medical College and the JJ Hospital. It's an amazing story.
Sir, can you tell us more about Charles Morehead, who used to work with Sir Robert Grant?
Yes, like McLean, who founded the first medical school which failed, Charles Morehead also was an extraordinary person. There is a marble bust which is, I think, now in the library of the Grand Medical College, which shows you his face and his features. And you can see that he looks almost like one of those Greek gods, you know, if you look at that sculpture. Imposing figure, very imposing figure. So he was appointed the first principal and the first professor of medicine at the Grand Medical College in 1845 when the college opened. But he was working on the college and the hospital 1840, after Robert Grant's death, when the sanction came, he immediately started working on the college and the hospital. And he worked on every single detail. The architectural plans, where the windows should be placed, how big the windows should be. And he said it is important for me to do all this because it's a very hot country. And if the windows are not properly placed, then there will be no ventilation and the patients will suffer in the heat. So he went into every possible detail you can think of. There are notes which he has written about how doors should be positioned, windows should be positioned. Now, Jamsetji Jeejebhoy had laid down a condition that there should be one particular ward where poor Parsis can be admitted. The government had already decided that there should be separate wards for Hindus and separate wards for Muslims, because the two communities may have difficulties if they are put in the same ward. So he had to plan all that also. How to keep the Muslims separate, how to keep the Hindus separate, how to keep the Parsis separate. And everything was... Now he was going to start a medical college from scratch. There was no museum, there was no library, there was nothing. The first subject that is going to be taught is anatomy. There were no anatomy specimens. So he imported from London wax models of anatomical parts. And those were made by a very famous wax modeler, medical wax modeler, by the name of Towne, Joseph Towne, T-O-W-N-E, Towne. He was internationally famous for his medical wax models. I'm just giving you an example of the thoroughness of this man. So he told the government of Bombay that we need these models. So they contacted London, we need these models. Everything has to go, Bombay, Calcutta, London. And he specified, I want them only by Towne. I don't want them by anybody else. So they contacted Towne. Towne says, okay, I'll beg them. Obviously, he charged the government, East India Company. Now those models, wax models, have to come by ship. There were no flights. It had to come by ship. Ship takes weeks and months to come here. What happens to the wax models in the heat? So Towne, when he sent those models, he wrote to Morehead saying, I want to know what is the condition of the models when they arrive. Are they still usable or have they melted? Fortunately, they were usable and they were absolutely as Towne had sent them. Obviously, he took all possible precautions. And those wax models, anatomy models, were kept in the Anatomy Museum. The Anatomy Museum actually needs a lecture by itself. You know, it was a nationally and internationally famed anatomy museum when Dr. P.S. Dastoor was in charge. Amazing museum. But that's a side story. So for the time being, we'll skip that. So Morehead set up the medical college and the hospital. He was a strict disciplinarian. The same kind of discipline he exacted from the students. Students had to write notes, students had to examine, once they finished anatomy physiology and went into the clinical field, they had to write down notes on the patients, there were discussions, there were seminars, all kinds of things were there which we have today, but very thorough. Everything was monitored and everything was recorded. This is what was done, this is what was done. This chap did not do this. If a student did not do it, it was recorded. This fellow had not done this. And he would be reprimanded. So, with this kind of standards, which were very, very high standards, and those standards remained right up to the time they graduated, you know, this college very quickly became very famous. Firstly, it became famous amongst the people in Bombay, because they were worried. Will any natives, as they used to, will natives come to this hospital? Because they would rather prefer to go to a Hakim or a white. Why should they come to our hospital? But once the natives saw the results of the hospital and how people who had been given up as cannot be treated by whites and Hakim were treated successfully and went home, more and more patients started coming in. So first they had to establish their own reputation, and then the reputation spread. And then of course they started getting patients from outside Bombay and all kinds of things happened. And eventually Morehead was recognized as one of the finest medical teachers in India because of the manner in which he taught and the manner in which he enforced. And whilst he enforced discipline, he was very, very sympathetic to the students. We'll come to the first batch of students in a minute, but he encouraged them. They were not even sure that they'll get medical students. Now, who will come to this kind of... So they paid a stipend. If you come as a medical student, the college will pay you so much money. It was a small amount of money, but what was 10 rupees at that time is today a huge amount of money, you know. And so they used to pay students to come. And some students paid because they were getting paid. They were earning money. That's why they came. They didn't want to learn medicine. But actually they did learn. Once they came in and they were put through all this discipline, and every one of the first batch of students became very eminent physicians. Some of them were extraordinary. They were international standard students. So coming to the first batch, they were worried that they may not get students, and so they tried hard to get them. But they didn't want any haltu-faltu students. They wanted good caliber students. Because if they didn't get good caliber students, then the college will suffer in reputation, you know. And they didn't want the reputation of what had happened to McLean School. Incidentally, McLean was a good friend of Morehead. And McLean was the chief examiner when the first batch of graduates came out. The final examination, McLean was chief of the examination board. And in his examination report, he praises the students and he praises the teachers. You know, he said they have done an extraordinary job. And he could do that because he had gone through this experience himself, you know, painfully. So he knew what it involved to teach. And so he was full of praise for his teachers and the students. They canvassed. There was something known as the school. I think it was called Elphinstone School, but I'm not sure of the name. Or it was called the School for Native Children or something, where they taught in English. So he tried to get the best students from there. And amongst those students was a gentleman by the name of Bhau Daji Lad. Now this name Bhau Daji is an interesting name because Bhau means brother. And Daji means what in Marathi?
Brother.
So that was not his real name, but everybody called him Bhau Daji Lad, and even today he's known the world over as Bhau Daji Lad. So Bhau Daji Lad was a very motivated kind of individual, very high intellectual caliber. And before he came to medical college, he had written a thesis against infanticide. See, female infanticide was a huge problem in those days. You know, the moment you know that this fetus is female, kill the fetus. You know, that was very, very prevalent. And particularly amongst a tribe known as the Jadejas. I think they are from Rajasthan, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm not sure. So Bhau Daji had written a thesis against female infanticide, and he won a prize for that thesis. This is before he came to medical college. He was, of course, an outstanding student. He won several scholarships. After some time, after a year or maybe 2 years, he said, look, you give me the honor of the scholarship, or the medal, but give the actual medal to somebody else. You know, because we should encourage others also. You can't keep on giving everything to me. So they used to say that Bhau Daji won this scholarship, but at his request, this is being given to number 2, who is so-and-so, so on. So Bhau Daji Lad was there, then there was Atmaram Pandurang Tarkhad, who also was a very eminent physician. Bhau Daji had, after he graduated, he set up a little hospital, along with his brother Narayan Daji, who was about 2 or 3 years junior to him, but from Grand Medical. This hospital, there is a report by a visitor, an English visitor, not an Indian. That guy writes that in this hospital, Bhau Daji and his brother are treating more patients than all the English physicians in Bombay combined together. That was the reputation that these two developed. People would prefer to come to them than to go to an English physician. Partly because it was expensive to go to an English physician, their charges were higher. But their results were good. That's why they came here. And both of them were said to be very good surgeons. And Bhau Daji also became famous because he used Shalmugra oil for the treatment of leprosy. At that time, leprosy was an incurable disease. There was no cure. Once you get leprosy, you're finished. He found out that Shalmugra oil helps. And so he started treatment with Shalmugra oil. And there are pictures, actual photographs of patients treated by Bhau Daji, because Narayan Daji was an expert photographer. So pictures before treatment, after treatment. Leprosy patients treated by Bhau Daji. Eventually, of course, Shalmugra oil gave way to Dapsone and all the other therapies which are there, rifampicin and all that, but that is recent. For a long time, there was nothing except Shalmugra oil for treatment of leprosy. There were students who came, the first batch also had students who came from Goa, because the Goa Medical College was in the doldrums at that time. And they felt that they would learn medicine better in Bombay. And so they emigrated to Bombay and joined Grand Medical. They also became famous. The first batch generally was an extraordinary batch. So that's about the foundation and the first batch of students.
Yes, sir. Anything else you want to add? Like, there were great professors like Van Dyke and all, who had done illustrations for the Gray's Anatomy. Would you like to mention something about him?
Yes, and I think probably one of the greatest teachers that Grand Medical College has ever had was Henry Van Dyke Carter. And we have a portrait, color portrait of him, which is in that collection which you have got here. It is in the library now. Henry Van Dyke Carter, when he graduated from Guy's Hospital in London, had as his senior a doctor by the name of Henry Gray. Henry Gray decided to write a textbook on anatomy. It's not that there were no textbooks on anatomy. There was Quain's textbook of anatomy and there were other textbooks, but Gray felt that those were substandard. And so he wanted to produce a textbook which would be unrivaled. So he started doing dissections for the textbook. But you need an illustrator. You need somebody who will make illustrations from those dissections. And he learned that this young doctor, Henry Van Dyke Carter, was an expert artist also. So he enrolled his help, saying, help me to produce this book. I will do the text, you and I will do the dissections, and you will make all the illustrations. So all the illustrations that are there in the first 16 or 18 editions of Gray Anatomy were all Van Dyke Carter's illustrations. And very quickly, in the book reviews that came out after the book was published, people praised Van Dyke Carter's illustrations more than they praised Henry Gray's text. And Henry Gray got upset. That after all, I have done this, I've done all this work, I've done the book and all that, and I'm praising this fellow. So there was some problem because of that, and Van Dyke Carter was in fact deprived of some credit which was due to him, and that's a separate story. So Van Dyke Carter then came to India and he was appointed as a professor at the Grand Medical College. Eventually he ended up as a principal of the Grand Medical College. And it was whilst Henry Van Dyke Carter was professor that he did some research on tropical diseases. He did research on fungal infections of the foot, mycetoma. And then he did a lot of research on leprosy. And he has produced books which are of this size, like this, big books. The reason why they are big is the illustrations are so big. And all those illustrations are drawn by him. And many of them are color illustrations. And one of the most often reproduced illustrations is the nerves in leprosy of the arm and forearm. So there is an arm and forearm dissected, all the nerves and the diseased areas in color. Beautiful illustration. And this has been reproduced hundreds of times in all kinds of books and journals and papers.
So like you said, there has been a lot of research in our institute. There has been Hopkins, Robert Koch. Can you shed some light on that?
First of all, you must remember that these early teachers, the first 10, 15, 20 years, had to ensure that the Grand Medical College remained an area of excellence. So they worked very, very hard to do that. And they did everything possible to make sure that the Grand Medical College remained a college of great reputation. And at one stage, the Grand Medical College was ranked higher than Calcutta and Madras. They said, if you rank them, number 1 is Grand Medical College, number 2 is Madras Medical College, and number 3 is Calcutta. And Calcutta was the capital. So, of course, the ranking went on changing from time to time, but it was 2 and 3 which kept on changing. Grand Medical remained number 1 for a long time, pretty long time. And because they wanted it to remain number 1, they worked very, very hard in every area. All these teachers who came there. Not all of them were of the caliber of Van Dyke Carter, but they were good in their own rights. I feel that the rot set in after independence, 1947, I think so. And when the Medical Council of India passed a rule that all medical colleges must have full-time teachers and full-time teachers only, this worsened. Because from 47 to at least 67, which is the time that I saw the college and the hospital, we still had teachers like Dr. Wadia, Dr. Antya, Dr. Udani, Dr. Darab Dastur. We still had eminent teachers. Once this law came in that everyone must have, all medical colleges must have only full-time teachers, the government of Maharashtra then took this up and got rid of all the honoraries and got all full-time teachers in. And unfortunately, see, one of the reasons why these honoraries were so good is because many of them were from the same institution. So, Grand Medical College had its students who became its teachers. GS Medical College had its students who became teachers. There was a fierce loyalty towards the institution. Once this full-time business came in, the government used the weapon of transfer. So if there is a professor who is inconvenient, who asks nasty questions, who makes demands, transfer this guy. And I think in the process, research took a great hit. Quality of teaching went down. Ethics and humanities more or less disappeared from the curriculum. And generally, standards, at least as I see it from the outside, have not been maintained. That's what I see.
So, you have studied history a lot. Why is it necessary to study history? What's its importance? What does history tell us?
History.
Yeah. Why we should study history?
Why should you study history? First of all, we owe a debt to all those who have made medicine what it is today. We are standing on the shoulders of people who have given us what we are using today. We are taking it for granted. Simple thing, hypodermic needle. Okay? There was no such thing as hypodermic needle once upon a time. There was no such thing as injection. They didn't know how to give injection. Who invented the hypodermic needle? Who invented the first syringe? Simple thing. There was a time when a doctor in France was embarrassed when he had to make a diagnosis in a patient suspected of pulmonary tuberculosis, because he needed to hear what was happening in the lungs. And the only way he could hear was to put his ear against the patient's chest, which was all right if he was a male and the patient was a male. But what happens if the patient is a female? And he has to put his ear on the chest. So one such doctor, because of this embarrassment, devised a tube. And he would put the end of the tube on the patient's chest and his ear on the other end of the tube, so he could hear those sounds. And that has evolved into our Lippmann's stethoscope. Sphygmomanometer, concept of blood pressure. See, all these things didn't exist. There was a time when it was believed, why is an artery called an artery? Why is an artery called an artery? Because it contained air. Therefore, it was called an artery. How can you say it contained air? Because arteries were studied at autopsy. When you open an artery at autopsy, it contains nothing. It contains air because you have just cut it open, so air has gone inside. So an artery contains air. Therefore, you call it artery because it contains air. It was when others started working on this, especially William Harvey, and came up with the idea of the circulation of blood, that this business of circulation of air, they called it pneuma. So the circulation of pneuma, and they used to believe that the nerves are hollow structures and animal spirits go through the nerves. So animal spirits are generated in the brain and they go through the hollow nerves and they go to all the different places, and that's why we can feel and we can move. Because nerves are hollow. Therefore they contain animal spirits. Why did they say the nerves are hollow? Because they were not allowed to dissect fresh bodies. They were allowed to dissect only putrefied bodies. Putrefied bodies, the nerves are all mush. You can't see any damn thing. So, all these are knowledge and wisdom which has been collected over the ages. And this has been collected and generated by individuals. I'll give you just one example of why we should learn history. Have you heard the name of a man called Claudius Galen? Claudius Galen was a physician, and he published, I think, 50, 60, 100 books on anatomy, physiology, medicine, etc. Somewhere 10th century, 11th century, somewhere around that time. I may be wrong about the date, but a long time ago. And soon after he published those books, the church in Europe became very, very powerful. And so if you did or said anything against the church, then you were in big trouble. And there were what was called the Inquisition. And you could be tortured by the church because you did something with the church that is wrong. The church adopted the teachings of Claudius Galen, and they said, this is right. What he has written is absolutely correct. Now what Claudius Galen had written was that a liver has multiple lobes. And the illustration that you see, the outline of the liver is like this. Okay? He said that there is something called the rete mirabile at the base of the brain. And he made several such statements. Because Claudius Galen had said this is gospel truth. It remained gospel truth for 300 years. For 300 years, this was the truth of anatomy. Then came a man called Andreas Vesalius. He dissected the human body and he said, I don't find a multilobulated liver, I don't find the rete mirabile. Then he looked, why did Galen say this? And he found that Galen said it because he dissected only animals. And animals have a multilobulated liver and have a rete mirabile. So he said, since animals have it, man also must have it. So he extrapolated. And Vesalius said, this is wrong. This is not so. And this was when the church's influence was just beginning to drop. But he was in danger of being killed. The church had decided that human beings should never be dissected. So no human dissections were permitted. And Vesalius wanted to dissect human beings. So he got bodies of individuals who had been hanged as punishment. And what they did at that time was, after the prisoner was hung, the body would be hung on the main road leading into that town. So supposing 4 people had been condemned to death and had been killed, 4 bodies would be hanging there. Why on the main road? To tell everyone who comes here, if you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. If you murder or if you do this crime or this crime, your body will be here. Vesalius would go in the middle of the night, nobody was there, and he would steal a leg, he would steal an arm, he would just cut it off and take it. Where would he take it? There was no dissection hall, there was no formaldehyde, there was no glutaraldehyde, there was nothing. He would take it to his little room and put it under his bed. So there would be a human part under his bed for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Can you imagine what the stink must have been? And this guy did this again and again and again. And if he had been caught, he would have been on the scaffold the next day. So at the risk of his life, he did dissections. And then he created that fantastic book on the fabric of the human body, which for all time is considered to be an anatomical classic. This is how he got that information, which he has put in that book, at the risk of his own life. So, if they have created or obtained knowledge with this kind of effort, shouldn't we at least know about it? Because then we get inspired, no? These stories serve as an inspiration. There are people who have died in the process of trying to learn something. They have tried to study an epidemic, got that epidemic and died. Got that disease and died. You know? So people have sacrificed their lives, people have risked their lives, people have undergone tremendous amount of hardships. Shouldn't we at least know about them and respect them and honor them for it? I don't know if you have heard of a chap called Andre Cournand. I think it was either Cournand or Forsman, I forget now. There are 2 names, one is Andre Cournand and the other one is Werner Forsman. Now I'm getting mixed up as to, but one of these 2, at that time there was no technique known by which you can study the inside of the heart. There was no known technique. Okay? This fellow said, why can't we put a tube? Why can't we put a tube either through a vein or through an artery and just put it and put that tube in the heart? Once we put the tube in the heart, we can inject some radio-opaque material and take pictures, because X-rays had already been discovered by that time. In 1898 or 99, Röntgen discovered X-rays. So they were already there. So he said, why don't we do this? So he went to his professor with the idea. He said, sir, I think we should pass a tube into the heart and then maybe we can do studies, take pictures, whatever. And the professor shouted him, do you want to kill people or what? This has never been done. You put a tube inside the heart. Who knows what it is going to do to the heart? The heart may go into fibrillation or something and the guy will die. You want that to happen? And he absolutely forbade him. What did this guy do? He didn't go to his hostel and say, "Arey yaar, professor ne na bola, main kya karu? Kuch nahi ho sakta hai." He cultivated the friendship of a nurse who was in charge of ureteric catheters. Ureteric catheters. He made friends with her. Then he told her about this idea. He's saying, I think this can be done. She agreed on condition that she would be the person into whom he would put that tube. He agreed. He said, yes, I agree with you. He didn't know what the risks are, and he certainly didn't want to risk her life, but he agreed. Then he said, so all the arrangements were made, the catheters were sterilized and kept, everything was done. And he put her on the table And he's saying, see, for this I have to tie your hands and legs to the table. So she said, okay. So he tied hands and legs to the table. Then he said, I'm just coming in 5 minutes. He took the ureteric catheter tray, went into another room, put it into his own vein and into his own heart. And then he went and released her because he could walk with this ureteric catheter inside. She was furious. She said, you told me you will put it in my... He mollified her sometime and he said, now just help me. We are on the ground floor. X-ray machine is on the first floor. Please help me to come there. He lay on that table. They took an X-ray which showed that that ureteric catheter went from the vein into the heart. And that is how cardiac catheterization, intra-arterial radiology, all that thing started from there. Now, should we know about this man? That is history. And you know, many people believe that history is dull. That is because that is how we were taught. The Mughals came into power in this era, the Guptas came into power, the first Gupta warrior, emperor lived from year to year, this one lived from year to year, this one lived from... That is history. That is not history. That is memorizing dates and names. What is history is what did Gupta so-and-so do? You know, talk about the Ashok Chakra, talk about the various edicts that were posted all over India. That is history. But the way history is taught is that everybody goes to sleep. So they assume that when you talk of medical history also, everybody is going to go to sleep. But that depends on how you teach medical history. If you teach it with live examples of people who have risked lives, people who have died, people who have discovered, how they discovered, why they discovered, what were the efforts which went into making that discovery, nobody's going to get bored. In fact, they'll get inspired. But that is not so. It doesn't happen that way. But anyhow, that's why I think that history is important.
So, how do you see the future of medicine in the next, say, 10, 20 years?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. Because I'm getting a little, fortunately, 10, 20 years from now, I won't be here, so I'm not going to face that. But for you, I have an apprehension. I hope it is not justified, but I have an apprehension. My apprehension is, already the whole world is seeing a decay in clinical talent. The ability to take a good history, the ability to do a good clinical examination, the ability to make a diagnosis without doing a single test. That ability is atrophying now. It is not atrophying in the last 1-2 years. In 1974-75, I was in London training. There was a professor of radiology there called George Duboulay. The first CT scanner had been installed in Queen Square. Queen Square is the center for, at that time was the biggest center for neurosciences in the whole of Britain, was at Queen Square in London. The first scanner, CT scanner, had been installed in Queen Square just 2 years earlier. I was there in 74-75, it had been installed in 73 or 72. And Duboulay was taking a class on CT scans. And he made this statement. Now remember, everyone was excited about the CT scanner. For the first time ever, we were able to see the inside of the living brain. We had never been able to see it. All the previous evidence was all indirect. We could see the ventricles, we could see the arteries, we could see the veins, but we could not see the parenchyma. There was no test which could show us the parenchyma. For the first time, the CT scan made it possible for us to see the inside of a living brain. Everyone was excited. And Duboulay started his talk on CT scans by saying, I think in a short while, we will feel very sorry that the CT scanner has been invented. He's a radiologist talking. Then he explained, he's saying what I foresee is that doctors will stop examining patients and will depend on the CT scan and the CT scanner for the diagnosis. And it is true. We have seen patients where the patient comes with 2, 3, 4, 5 CT scans, MR scans, etc., etc., etc. And then you ask them, why was the first scan done? नहीं साहब, हमने डॉक्टर को पूछा हमको एक अपॉइंटमेंट दो, तो उन्होंने हमको टेलीफोन पे पूछा आपको तकलीफ क्या है, सर में दर्द है. हाँ ठीक है, आप एक काम करिए, आप ये सीटी स्कैन सेंटर पे जाइए, ये सीटी स्कैन करवाइए और फिर स्कैन लेकर मेरे पास आइए. Do the CT scan at this center and then come to me. Okay, that this center itself makes you, warning bells start sounding. Now, he hasn't even examined the patient and he's telling him, go and do this is already happening. I have seen it happening. So, one of my fears about the next 15, 20 years is that clinical sense will atrophy further. It has already atrophied. The second thing is automation is coming in a big way now. Robotic surgery and all kinds of artificial intelligence. And I do hope that artificial intelligence will not replace human intelligence, because I fear that may happen. We may become too reliant on robots and artificial, because it's easy, no? It's easy to be reliant on them. You say, this is artificial intelligence, this is the program, and that program says this is the likely diagnosis. Finished. Ho gaya. Kaam ho gaya aapka. You don't have to use your brain now. Whether it's right, wrong, if it's right, it's okay. If it's wrong, the patient suffers. No, you don't suffer. So, these are the fears that I have. I hope that they will not be justified, but this is what I'm a little worried about. That human being to human being interactions will become minimal. That mechanization will increase. That dependence on machines for diagnosis and treatment will increase. And skills, which we, have taken so much trouble to develop, clinical skills, surgical skills, operative skills, all these skills may slowly atrophy. This is my fear. I hope it doesn't happen.
Finally, sir, I would like you to share your experiences, the life lessons you have learned for the future doctors and whoever is watching this show right now. What are your message for the future generation?
I am not qualified to give any message, but I can quote to you messages which have been given by two people. If you ask anyone in the English-speaking world today about what should you read to be a good doctor, they will immediately tell you, read Osler, like I was told. Read Osler's Equanimitas. They will tell you. Because Osler is today considered as the epitome of the good doctor. And his work is so easily available. You can download Equanimitas from the internet now. You don't even have to buy it. So this is what everybody quotes, and justifiably, because Equanimitas has absolutely incredible lessons for all of us. But I think what not many people have recognized is that when William Osler was a child, 5 or 6 years old, Morehead was already principal of Grand Medical College and professor of medicine. And if you read his address to the graduating students of the first batch of Grand Medical College, much of what Osler says is there. Much of what he says. Do not consider that your education is complete now that you have graduated. Medicine is a lifelong educational process. You can't stop learning. You have to keep on learning. Medicine can only be learned at the bedside of the patient. It cannot be learned through books. All this Osler says. And Osler is famous for his statements. But all this Morehead had said while Osler was still a child. Now, the reason why both of them have emphasized the same kind of teaching is because both of them were followers of a French physician by the name of Pierre Louis. Pierre Louis was a physician, I think at the Salpêtrière or La Pitié. There were two big hospitals in Paris, and he was a physician in one of them. He was a firm believer of learning medicine at the bedside. And he taught all his students history taking, examination, maintaining notes, detailed notes on the effects of the treatment that you are giving, and if the patient dies, what is found at the autopsy. All these were mandatory for anyone who worked with Pierre Louis. Morehead worked with Pierre Louis. And he brought Pierre Louis' teachings to the Grand Medical College. And Osler, Pierre Louis was dead by the time Osler became a physician. But when Osler visited Paris for the first time, he paid a visit to the tomb of Pierre Louis. There's a photograph. Osler at the site of Pierre Louis' tomb. So they were all students of the same school of philosophy. Now, even Pierre Louis was not the first to emphasize bedside teaching. There was Herman Boerhaave in the Netherlands, and there was Thomas Sydenham in England. They had also been teaching bedside medicine. So these are all the great teachers of clinical medicine. And I think we need to learn from them. So if I was to recommend anything to anybody, I would say read the works of these teachers. Certainly, Osler is very easily available. You must read his works. Morehead is not as easy to get, but the lectures are available. You should read his lectures. This graduation address is just one of them. There are other lectures which he had given whilst he was professor. And many of these lectures are there in the annual reports. They have been reproduced in full in the annual reports. Morehead lectures. That's why that book is very important for us. And then, of course, the other lesson is about treating the patient as a human being and forever remembering that you are there primarily to help him. Your main purpose, the reason for your being there, is to help your patient. If you realize this, you will automatically realize that you can't cheat him. If you are there to help him, how can you cheat him? Yeah, you have to help him. And people like us who work in poor people's hospitals, Ggmc, and so on, we have to be extra careful because these are the poorest of the poor. If we don't treat them, they will just go in a corner and die. There's nothing else they can do. They can't go to Jaslok and Bombay Hospital and Hinduja and Nanavati. They can't. They don't have the money. So, behaving with patients as one human being to another human being, I think that is crucial. These are the messages.
Thank you so much, sir. It was an honor to have you on our show. We couldn't thank you.